Welcome back, Nerglings. Today we are returning to Warhammer Fantasy Battle, this time with a focus on the time of the ancients, including everything from the elves to the dwarves and their battles with the forces of chaos, plus the rise of humanity and his alliances against the darkness. But before we start, be sure to like, share and subscribe so you don't miss an update. If you fancy switching on notifications too, that would be spiffing. The Eldar Age. With the collapse of the warp gates, the age of the Slann was over and a new age had begun. Because it was an age dominated by the elves and dwarves, it is known as the Eldar Age, the age of the two Eldar races. The Slann still lived, but their descendants were gradually losing technical knowledge and understanding. At the same time, they were gaining a new understanding of the creatures they had created. Magic and science were used together in the desperate struggle to control the chaotic forces unleashed during the disaster. The Slann forgot much of their mighty past, but discovered a new insight into magic and philosophy that formed the basis of the arcane lore of future times. During their early development, the elves had been transplanted from their place of origin in the Southlands to the circular continent of Ulthuan. They had enjoyed the direct tutelage of the Slann and had gained a high level of civilization, as well as an understanding of the dangers of chaos. With the decline of the Slann, the elves were left to fend for themselves. They quickly learned how to harness the cooperation of several benign entities, using ritual magic and worship. Fortunately, their nature enabled them to control the new forces to an extent impossible to other races. They were lucky too, in that the terrifying clouds of warpstone dust had only a minor effect upon the continent of Ulthuan, and the elves were mostly uncorrupted by it. For 1,000 years following the fall of the Slann, the elves struggled to maintain their lands. Their population shrank at first and then grew again. Their cities fell to ruin, but were rebuilt in new and wonderful forms. Within 1,000 years the elves had reached the height of their vigour and were poised to begin an age of exploration. Their voyages took them east and west in search of new lands. In the east, the elves discovered the Old World and founded a number of coastal colonies. At that time, the Old World was heavily forested, and for many years the elves made no attempt to venture inland. In time, trade developed between the settlers and the primitive dwarfs of the distant mountains. The elves were keen to acquire the valuable minerals and gems mined by the dwarfs, whilst the dwarfs were hungry for the knowledge the elves possessed. Between the mountains and the sea lay a whole continent whose only inhabitants were creatures of evil or the foul distortions of chaos. This wilderness of danger presented a considerable threat to both races, and an alliance was formed with the intent of cleansing the Old World. This was to a large degree successful, so that the goblins, orcs and other unfriendly creatures were driven northwards or else deep within the forests. Following the cleansing of the Old World, the elder races grew apart, coming to rely upon each other less and less. Eventually, relations between them became hostile. Over a 400-year period, the two races warred constantly. Both sides suffered heavy losses, but the dwarfs were eventually victorious, and the elves abandoned their cities, sailing back into the west and their island home of Ulthuan. A few elves remained behind, hidden in the deeper woods, away from the dwarf realms, and protected by powerful magical enchantments. These scattered communities were to become known as the Wood Elves, and their ancestors still live in the forests today. To the west, the elves discovered the northern part of the continent, the southern portion of what forms Lustria. Lustria was inhabited by the rapidly declining Slann, but the New World, as this northern area was called, was uninhabited at the time. The elves established a number of communities along the eastern seaboard, communities which have continued to thrive ever since. Although they were powerful magicians, the elves were but children compared to their masters, the Slann. Many misunderstood the powers they manipulated, turning towards the gods of chaos and the promise of easy power. For many years these so-called Dark Elves were tolerated amongst elven society. As the years passed, however, their excesses grew apace, until the towers of Lothan echoed to the sound of sacrifice and incantation. The vast majority of elves were to prove extremely resistant to the lure of chaos, and eventually the division between the two kindreds gave vent to their differences in civil war. Ulthuan was plunged into bloody conflict, her colonies were temporarily sundered, and her energies diverted towards internal strife. The war lasted for 200 years and ended in complete defeat for the Dark Elves and their exile into the New World. The Dark Elves were driven from Ulthuan and eventually settled in the northern land called Naggaroth, where they founded Naggarond, or Tower of Chill. Meanwhile, the primitive dwarfs followed the warming climate northwards, reaching the Old World a short time after the fall of the Warp Gates. The dwarfs spread along the great north-south chain of mountains called the World's Edge Mountains, following their path from the equator, the northern part of the Old World. As the dwarfs spread, they dug tunnels to connect their growing realm and built fortresses to protect its borders. At first, they lived in natural caverns before transitioning to crude stone dwellings and, finally, mighty fortresses hewn from the very mountains themselves. The dwarves of modern times date their arrival in the Old World with the founding of their capital city, Karaz-e-Karak, which means highest peak, and enduring forever, although is sometimes also called Everpeak. The dwarves were seriously affected by the clouds of warpstone dust that covered the world when the warp gates collapsed. Perhaps for this reason, many dwarves exhibit traces of chaotic, irrational, and self-destructive behaviour. At the time of the disaster, they were socially primitive, without the understanding of magic enjoyed by the elves. Because of these factors, the dwarves never gained much knowledge over supernatural forces, or a proper understanding of the nature of the gods. However, by the time the elves had arrived, the dwarfs were already somewhat skilled builders, metalworkers, and warriors. They had met and overcome countless creatures of chaos, and their eternal struggle against the orcs and goblins had already begun. Notwithstanding their achievements, the dwarfs were indelibly tainted by the initial incursion of chaos, and remain inclined to greed, isolationism, and occasionally even cruelty. The dwarfs eventually drove their rivals the elves from the Old World, but at terrible cost. Weakened by centuries of warfare, their realm was to prove vulnerable to the goblins. The dwarfs found themselves unable to defend their realm, and one by one their fortresses fell to the invading orcs and goblin hordes. Matters were made worse when volcanic activity to the east forced the abandonment of a large section of the dwarf domain. The old mountain kingdom was divided into countless small pockets and isolated holds, each left to defend itself as best it could. The war continued in this way for about 1,000 years, ending only when the first humans allied with the dwarfs to drive the creatures of evil from the Old World once more. When the slam fell, their genetic experiments were left unsupervised. Of these, the elves had already acquired a high level of civilization, and the dwarfs had taken the first cultural steps that would enable them to develop swiftly in the following centuries. Humanity, however, was a very new experiment indeed. At the time of the fall, the ancestors of humans were settled in the equatorial regions. Their cultural level was that of tool-using apes, and no more. Culturally uninformed, physically unrefined, the humans were especially vulnerable to the warping influences of chaos. This had many individual effects, including the spawning of countless mutations, the acceleration of physical and cultural progress, and the general shaping of the human mind. Unlike the creatures that had gone before, humans possessed a vigour and mental adaptability derived from chaos. These positive qualities were to enable humanity to grow swiftly and strongly. At the same time, the corrupting influence of chaos was firmly planted within the human mind, making humans especially susceptible to the whims of chaos. By the time primitive Stone Age hunters moved north into the Old World, some were already worshipping the gods of chaos, practicing evil magic and perpetrating the horrors of blood sacrifice. At this time, the majority showed few, if any, outward signs of corruption. Only fresh generations would uncover the true damage wrought upon the last creation of the Slann. Moving into the Old World, some 3,500 years after the fall of the Slann, primitive hunting bands met the long-established dwarfs. The elves had long since fled the Old World, and the dwarfs were engaged in their bitter struggles against the goblins. At first, the primitive humans went unnoticed amidst the turmoil. It was as a result of occasional contact with dwarven holds that humans began to learn of the rudiments of agriculture, metalwork, and building. After centuries of development, the early humans had formed solid ties with the dwarfs and began to fight alongside them. The most successful of these tribes was the Unberogen, led by the legendary Sigmar. Sigmar was to gain great acclaim amongst the dwarfs and went to work building himself a mighty realm the humans could call their own. Countless small tribes were eager to accept Sigmar as their ruler, and for the first time humanity had been brought under common rule. Primitive human groups occupied several areas throughout the world during the Eldar Age, including Lustria and Cathay. In Lustria, the Amazons and Pygmies would turn inwards, preferring isolation from humanity. In Cathay, the humans there would be brought to heel by the Emperor Warlord Yamyakuki. Meanwhile, as humans drifted northwards through the Old World, they were followed by another group of intelligent creatures called Halflings. Small both in numbers and size, the Halflings escaped notice for many years, and eventually came to settle in the sheltered vales of Stirland in a place called the Moot. Halflings may have been the last attempt by the Slann to engineer a race resistant to the impending doom. In many respects they may have succeeded, as Halflings are almost completely immune to the warping effects of chaos. However, the experiment was never finished, and the Halflings remained diminutive in stature, and thus reliant on their larger cousins in the humans for protection. The Age of Man. The Eldar Age is said to end with the Goblin Wars, a war from which the dwarfs were never to fully recover, and which opens the Old World to the new human nations. The imperial calendar, the most commonly used of human reckonings, dates from the founding of the empire at IC1. This was approximately 4,500 years after the fall of the Slann, and 2,500 years before the present day. The New Age was not marked in any profound way for the elves of Ulthuan. Their own dating system is consequently much older than that of humanity. And the same is true of the dwarves, who date the end of the Goblin Wars as the year 3502. With the establishment of what would become the Empire, the first human nation was born. During the following centuries, humanity grew in number and now stands culturally advanced. Gunpowder weapons are becoming common, the study of science and magic goes hand in hand, and everywhere there is a feeling of progress. To the common people, the threat of chaos has receded, yet the seeds of corruption are planted within everyone and may sprout at any time. Mutation and worship of the dark gods is not openly tolerated and forms a secretive and sinister side to humanity. What will be the fate of humanity remains a mystery from this viewpoint, although we all know the ultimate doom that befalls it. Over the centuries, as the elves withdrew from their colonies and humanity gained a foothold, seafaring humans became commonplace, finding the distant lands of Cathay and Lustria and new trading routes along the tidal waters of the coast. The sundering of the Eldar races and the rise of humans led the ancient civilizations to dwindle and stagnate. The dwarfs, too few in number, remain in the old world, resolutely defending their holds whilst simultaneously declining in number. With too few of them to successfully defend their realm, the dwarfs may be able to liberate parts of their realm from the goblin menace for a brief time, but have insufficient resources to keep them. The elves, meanwhile, remain isolated and split, with some remaining in Oldhammer, others keeping their homes amongst humans in Marienburg, and the evil scum of the Dark Elves remaining at large as corsairs and pirates venturing forth from Nagarond. All the races now have very different ambitions and modus operandi. There is no singular all-encompassing threat to unite them. Yet. Timeline. Here you can see we have an abridged timeline that details a few key points in the history of the Warhammer world. However, it is paltry compared to what is available today. The Old World. The map of the Old World shows its principal upland areas. These are not the only highlands by any means, but are the largest such features, presenting almost insurmountable barriers to travellers and invaders alike. These huge mountains may be crossed only by means of passes and important strategic points. The largest mountains are, of course, the World's Edge Mountains, which delineate its eastern edges. Other mountains are shown but less impressive in reality. Mountains form the first line of defence for the human nations, as well as providing the Old World with many of its natural boundaries. The rivers Reich, Sanez, Grismery, Brienne and Morkau are vast indeed, requiring ships to traverse at their widest points. All of these rivers are far larger, for instance, than their European equivalents. The Old World, being as large as it is sparsely populated in parts. Its human inhabitants occupy cities, towns and villages, isolated from each other by leagues of barren wastelands, lonely tracts and the wilds. Any order that exists is confined to within city walls. Whilst the Empire is the largest of the human realms, Bretonnia is almost as powerful today. Although, having said this, the current king is somewhat a despot, preferring glittering parties and unending debauchery rather than concentrating on maintaining his borders and alliances. Aristocrats and kings alike seem myopically ignorant of the true state of the realm, whilst those few genuinely caring nobles look to the defence of their own estates and underlings. The Estalian kingdoms are many and various, each led by independent rulers who war with each other over minor and trifling matters. They cannot be relied upon in times of need and only will unite in times of great tumult. Typically, Estalian cities are well built and fortified, and they must be to survive the constant infighting between city-states that occurs. Kislev grew from the many scattered states established after the Gospodar invasions of the Old World approximately 800 years prior. Having survived this invasion, Kislev grew to be a powerful state on the front line against Chaos. During the incursion of Chaos, Prague was destroyed, and it took the combined might of Kislev and a crusading empire force, led by Magnus the Pious, to push the forces of darkness back. The Tylean city-states are a group of culturally similar, although politically fragmented, city-states clustered around the shores of the Tylean Sea. Most of the cities are wealthy trading ports, backed by small but efficient navies. In this, the Tyleans are the direct rivals of Estalia. Both nations are inclined to think of the other as pirates, and sea battles between them are very common. Of particular interest is the island city of Sartosa, the pirate city, administered by the annually elected pirate king, who provides safe haven for pirate vessels. The border princes lie between the Black Mountains and Black Gulf. It is a rather barren region that was sparsely settled until the founding of Bretonnia, when disinherited nobles and adventurers fleeing from internal strife struck out to settle what was then known as the Bad Lands. For almost a century, the adventurers waged war on the goblins, but eventually succeeded in driving their enemy back to Blood River. The Wasteland is an independent state centred around the city of Marienburg, the most prosperous trading port in the Old World. It was once a part of the empire, but its independent mentality grew alongside its great wealth, and soon it was too unruly a city-state to control. Urged on by promises of support from Bretonnia, it declared independence from imperial control. The dwarfs surviving in their ancient realm of Karaz-a-Karak are known as imperial dwarfs, proud of their culture, language, and heritage in equal measure. They are contemptuous of humans and even of those dwarfs who live amongst them, yet their declining numbers mean they grudgingly rely upon support from their dwarven kin who live in the Empire. Indeed, there are more dwarfs living among humans today than there are deep in the mountain holds they call their ancestral home. As such, dwarvish troops serve in almost all human armies. The wood elves of the Laurelorn Forest in the Empire and the Lauren Forest of Bretonnia are few in number and intensively secretive. Most communities number less than 100 individuals, who live predominantly in the trees within aerial houses constructed from the trees themselves. The largest wood elf realm is Athel Lauren, the city of the Elf King, situated deep within the Lauren Forest. It is protected by numerous traps, enchantments, and guardians of the dark forests. The king and queen who reside there are the traditional rulers of all wood elves in the Old World. The sea elves, meanwhile, effectively control the Great Western Ocean, enabling fleets to safely traverse its treacherous waters. Most travelling elves are sea elves, passing through settlements on trading missions before moving on to somewhere new. To facilitate their trade, some elves have settled in the Old World permanently, creating elvish quarters within the cities of the Empire. So that's it for today. We learned about the trials and tribulations of the elves and dwarfs, their alliances with humanity and their battles against chaos, followed by their gradual decline. The rise of man, his expansion throughout the Old World, and the hope he brings to this faltering planet. I hope you enjoyed this video as much as I did researching and rereading my battered old copy of Warhammer Fantasy Battle. Anyways, thanks very much for watching, and I'll catch you on the next one.